In this video we are going to be exploring the half back stitch. You can see here that it creates a dashed line on the outer side, the side you're working from, which is usually the exterior of the garment. And on the back side you can see that every half a stitch there is sort of a double layer of the thread from the stitching on the previous side. So that would be, you'd want that to be on the interior of your fabric. So let's get started. I've already prepped my needle. I'm using a 10 millimeter. I would recommend a 9 sharp for beginning stitchers. I am using a 100% polyester dark colored thread so you can see my stitching. And I'm also have pre-conditioned my thread so that it is not going to knot. My favorite is going to be Thread Heaven. You can use beeswax, which is also a great thread conditioner. Just make sure that you always run it through your fingers before you start sewing so that there's no residue left on the thread. Then I am going to start with a knot. So when I knot my thread, I'm going to wrap it around my finger, and then I'm going to just roll this off, which is then wrapping my tail through the loop multiple times. And then I'm going to pull that tight. So there's my knot, and you can see I have a long exterior tail, so I'm going to clip close to my tail. I do not want it to clip right at my knot because then I would have a risk of the knot slipping off, and since we're going to hide the knot in the tail anyway, this really is not an issue. So again, try to leave a small tail when making your knots. Now I have a double layer of muslin here. Because usually with the back stitch we are going to be stitching multiple layers together, so we want to practice on that. We also have already marked a line in a friction marker. I've tried to keep it a lighter color so that it doesn't show or hide our thread, so we can see our thread easily. And then I've also gone through and with my ruler I have marked every 1/4 of an inch just as a guideline for today. Normally I wouldn't mark this on a actual garment. I would eyeball this, but you do want to try to be as consistent as possible when doing this stitch. Now the first part of this stitch is I'm going to come into the second mark that I've had. I'm also going to separate my 2 layers and pull this up in between so that I am hiding my tail between my 2 layers. So I have, as you can see, my thread coming out of the second stitch. So the second mark. So if I come back, I'm going to come back a 1/4 of an inch. I'm actually going to skip over the first mark and go to basically number 4. So my thread is coming out of the second mark. I'm coming back to the first mark, and then we count to the 4th mark here, and that's where I'm going to be pulling out. So essentially I'm going back half of the length that I'm going forward. And then we're just going to continue to do that. So I'm going back 1 and then going forward 2 past where my thread is based. So back 1, forward 1, 2. This is the same stitch that you see in embroidery. Back 1, forward 2. When you're stitching this, please be careful not to pull this too tight so that it starts to pucker. It's very easy with this half back stitch to do that. So back 1, forward 2. Back half the length, going forward a full length. Back half the length, going forward a full length. And as you can see now, we have equal distant dashes coming, the amount that's showing on the surface is equal to the space in between each of these. It looks a little bit like an even baste. The difference is that because we're backing over what we've already stitched, it's actually creating a stronger, more permanent stitch. This is also the stitch that we see when sometimes we want this decorative dashed line. It was very popular to see this on suit coats for a short time. You can still see it occasionally on other kind of top stitching details. Keep this flat as I'm going along. And we are almost to the end. And then I'm going to do one last stitch. I need one more mark, so I'm just going to eyeball where that mark would be. And then I'm going to just do a regular stitch for this last stitch, just to continue my pattern. Now I need to knot this off, so I'm going to take a very small stitch right next to where my thread came out. And you can see I have a loop there, so I'm going to come through that loop at least 2 or 3 times. I'm going to pull that tight so that it's not creating any lumps. And then I am going to stitch between my 2 layers, going back in where my knot is placed and coming out over off to the side. And what this does is pulling my knot tight to the fabric and then hiding my tail so it's protected. I'm going to trim that close. And there is my half backstitch. If we look at it on the outside, or the inside of the material, you can see where it is doubled over every half of a stitch. So this is our half backstitch.